a more broad, more general discussion here to kick off the pod. And I want to ask you guys just what 2022 looks like generally from a legislation standpoint, because there are some people out there sitting in their state, and we have mentioned their state probably a dozen to 24 times on this podcast in various forms of maybe, possibly, potentially getting something done. And I'm sure they're wondering, what is going to happen in my state, or what is coming down the pike maybe next year, whatever it might be. So I just want to kind of open the floor to you guys and let you discuss where we are right now in some of these states and where we are kind of leading to.
Yeah, I'll start it off. Adam and I were just talking about this separately, not on the podcast. And I'm like, maybe this makes a good podcast topic. But the map kind of looks bleak. And I know I'm an eternal pessimist on sports betting legalization. I've set a line that was exceeded the over every year. But we may actually get, I think I put 3.5 states, new states to legalize this year. And man, I'm the under, as we sit here, looking like a good bet. There are not a whole lot of states where we have even guaranteed or like a really good chance of movement. And we talk about these every week to some degree, but just to put it out there, like right now we have Kansas looks pretty good. Missouri, if Kansas legalized, we also think has a pretty good chance. But as we sit here, everything else looks kind of dire in terms of whether we think it's going to happen or not. We've taken some states off the board, like Georgia already. So this is kind of the wide. We've been saying this for a long time. There's a lot of states that have already legalized something. That means the available bucket of states legalized is smaller. So it's not like this God-given right that we're all just always going to have new states legalize things. And then we have other states that have legalized some form of sports betting, but don't yet have online sports betting or a competitive market. So there's a lot going on here, and it's interesting for the market dynamics, is because big companies like DraftKings and FanDuel and MGM are counting on this growth for their own growth and for their shareholders. And then it starts looking, when you look at the map and start breaking it down, again, maybe I end up being a pessimist, but the map doesn't look real great for new states legalizing in 2023.
Adam, what are you seeing? What are you feeling? What do you see maybe coming down the pike a little bit?
So to what Dustin said, I think the most important point in there was we had a much smaller pool to choose from this year, and the states that hadn't legalized up until this point, or at least hadn't legalized mobile, there were very clear reasons for the opposition, right? There are only a couple of states left at this point that we're kind of scratching our heads and saying, okay, why haven't they legalized? Because it seems like they have the ability to do so, the will to do so, and the company's pushing them to do so. So what states are those? Massachusetts is at the top of the list, where you look and say, how exactly is it that this has not happened yet? Like, the big dig happened faster in Boston than this has happened in Massachusetts, and it feels like there's just no sense of urgency there, which, given the fact that DraftKings is headquartered in Massachusetts, always feels like something that does not make a lot of sense, right? Georgia is close, but not quite. We understand the cultural opposition that is there in Georgia. The South is never a guarantee when it comes to legalizing gambling in any form. Georgia, of course, would have to change the Constitution. But other states that we look at, what are the obvious barriers that we see? Some of them have religious or cultural opposition, as I mentioned. Some of them have tribal gaming interests that have a large measure of control over the market, right? We saw this happen with Florida. We saw the concerns of tribal gaming kind of steamrolled in New York for the most part. And of course, California, it's going to be all about what happens with tribal gaming interests. So Texas, of course, is kind of down the line a little bit. But I think the upshot of all of this is that whatever money we thought was going to be spent in California, go ahead and just add more and more to that pot of how much money is going to be spent on those ballot initiatives in California. Because if you're one of these big companies that has to answer to shareholders, and you're looking at the map this year and saying, okay, Kansas, but how big is Kansas really going to be? There are, I believe one professional sports team plays in Kansas. You have an MLS team playing in Kansas right now. You have Missouri, which will be a little bit larger. And then really, what are you expecting before Ohio comes to pass either at the very end of this year or at the beginning of 2023. So I think you look at California and say the fight over California is going to be even more intense than what you might initially have imagined.
And we're picking at the margins. Like, again, a lot of the states that we're talking about, not huge states. Obviously, Missouri, a fairly sizable state if they were to get through, and some of these others too. But like, yeah, I mean, these aren't necessarily needle movers. And yeah, I look at it from that standpoint. Like, if you're not getting growth via, or through just growing your brand and getting more customers in existing states, you're pointing to, the opportunity is still larger. Both sports betting, and we always kind of tack on casino as something that stands out there that has not been fully realized in the United States in addition to poker. But like, yeah, I totally agree with Adam. Like, I look at the map and I'm going, to use the poker reference, all in on California if I am one of these companies and spending $1 bazillion, because if you don't get California, and yeah, you're counting on Texas meeting in a short time frame next year to get done. You have Florida out there. Probably need another ballot measure till 2024. Like, we keep talking about these three states, but they're hanging out there and very uncertain. And your best bet right now is California. You can get a ballot measure on there. You can get online sports betting with commercial entities operating outside, and that to me is it should be the story of the rest of the year. Is that this push should happen? You have the leagues, you have all the major operators kind of pushing for this. Obviously, the other side of this is the tribal casinos, which really have not really expressed interest for this and want this to happen on their terms. So. Yeah, I mean, I would spend infinity money on California if I am any of these companies trying to change and flip the map, a little bit election style. But yeah, it looks bad to me. Just as we hear, there's dribs and drabs of news, and it's like, yeah, we don't know what's going to happen in any of these states, and you need a lot of them to happen for there to be like a meaningful population increase if you're not getting one of these three big states.
So if you look at that and start to play the long game, Dustin, and think about what companies have chosen to go all in at the jump versus what companies have kind of said, okay, you know what, we're going to hold off a little bit and wait to see how this develops. I think what you look and see is that if you're a company like DraftKings or PointsBet, who we've talked about as companies where cash on hand could become a concern here before too long, you're probably going to have to start moving harder into retention than acquisition, right? Unless you're going to go out there and try to steal customers from another sports book, or unless you're going to try to buy up a smaller competitor and maybe consolidate your market share a little bit. Because right now, if we don't have another big state come along here, and I guess Ohio is going to be maybe a boon for some of these states that haven't, for some of these companies that haven't been able to see much growth of late. I think beyond that, you look to say, okay, if you're one of these companies where cash on hand has at least been a concern on investor calls, how long are you going to be able to keep the lights on if we don't have another big state or another set of smaller states that can add up, come along and legalize here sometime soon? I think that's why the failure to qualify that ballot initiative in Florida by DraftKings et al. Was a major, major failure that should not have happened for companies of that size with that amount of capital to put into it. The fact that they didn't manage to get something qualified in Florida could be one of those things we look back on at the end of the year, the end of the decade even, and say, wow, that really changed the trajectory of U.S. sports betting.